How Singapore became the mega-rich country it is today. In 1963, when it became independent from the British Empire, and after its economy was devastated by the Japanese occupation during World War II, Singapore was nothing more than a conglomeration of shacks. A place where every bathroom and kitchen were shared by several families. Things were difficult economically and socially, and they weren't very different politically either. The truth is that Singapore's origins weren't promising at all. Singapore joined Malaysia at first, but the romance didn't last long. Just 2 years later, in 1965, and after numerous political and ethnic clashes with the aristocratic and extractive government of Malaysia, Singapore was expelled from the Malaysian Federation, and was effectively forced to declare itself independent. Folks, the challenge this small territory faced was enormous. Singapore was poor, had fewer than 2 million inhabitants and lacked natural resources. It wasn't even self-sufficient in terms of food and water. But just a second, because the story we all know is a little different, don't you think? Today, just 5 decades later, Singapore is an independent country, and this city-state is one of the world's capitals and one of the richest territories on the planet. Folks, sit down. Since 1960, the economy in Singapore has grown by over 7.5% annually. We are talking about a huge growth rate, which has allowed Singapore to experience the fastest development process in the history of mankind. Today the per capita income of this city is much higher than that of the United States. It is more than double that of middle-income countries like Spain, and almost 4 times that of Chile, which is considered the richest country in the country. Latin America. Don't tell me it's not surprising. Now, the question we can all ask is, how did this small city-state achieve such a great deal of economic growth? Well, let's see. Folks, the whole story has a clear protagonist, Lee Kuan Yew, the autocratic prime minister who ruled Singapore between 1959 and 1990. Now, few people would have bet that this country would have a bright future. As General Secretary of the People's Action Party, a party belonging to the International Socialist Party, this prime minister initially flirted with so-called import substitution industrialization policies. A political approach that is blindly committed to protectionism as a means to achieve development. Something that was particularly popular throughout the 20th century in Latin America. Well, actually, it still is. Indeed, in his early years of rule, Lee Kuan Yew was closer to Argentine politicians than anyone who supported free markets and globalization. However, unlike in Latin America, Singapore soon realized that this kind of politics was by no means the best way to escape poverty. That is why, starting in 1965, a very different approach was launched, a political and economic commitment that completely transformed Singapore, opening up to the global market. When most of the third world countries denounced the exploitation of Western multinationals, we invited them to Singapore. This is how we have achieved the growth, technologies and know-how that have increased our productivity more than any other economic policy could have done. Lee Kuan Yew. Now, Singapore has been nothing close to a prototype of an orthodox libertarian state, in which the government does not interfere in any economic activity. On the contrary, the government of Singapore has played and still plays a very important role. But let's say they did it in a very different way from what we are used to. For example, in old Europe. Things are changing rapidly and we have to adapt and keep up. Because of technology, globalization, we have had to anticipate what is happening. We have to help companies and workers to adapt. Lee Sheng Long. In Singapore, the government has not tried to take over the larger sections of the economy, nor have they tried to regulate everything down to the smallest detail, nor, of course, did they seek to expand public spending and taxes. Quite the opposite. In the case of Singapore, we can basically think of it as a state company or, better still, a city company. That is, Lee Kuan Yew understood that Singapore needed to attract capital and professionals, so that the country could grow and develop, and within an imperfect competitive environment between economies and the heavy intervention that exists in the countries we live in, the state can play a key role. And it can do so with policies that always favor competitiveness, investment and business attraction, rather than bureaucracy or well-being. That is why the Singapore authorities have developed institutions to ensure legal security and efficient city management. They have promoted the economic sectors through public-private collaboration. They have elaborated an ambitious program of productive infrastructures and, above all, they have promoted savings. And that's not all. All policies have been designed within a rigid framework of budget stability and always with the mentality of integrating them with private agents, which rarely happens in countries like Spain, Italy or, of course, Argentina. Okay, let me explain. It is not so much about expanding a port or a street, but about being able to integrate an attractive institutional framework with services that force companies to settle in a country and invest to increase their productivity. Let's put it another way. How do companies compete in the market? Offering better terms than the competition, right? Well, Lee Kuan Yew understood that in our world the competition between countries is not very different. Therefore, perhaps the best way to see and understand Singapore's keys to success is to see this city-state not as a country to use, but as a service provider in a competitive industry. In Singapore, the government realized that the community itself, the city itself, was an asset and that, well managed, it could become a competitive advantage. But to understand this better, let's take a look at some concrete examples of the policies Lee Kuan Yew has put on the table. First goal: despite having a city with a high population density, turn it into a non-chaotic, noisy and uncontaminated place. To do this, the government imposed traffic taxes in 1975. So today traffic in the city is subject to tolls that are electronically charged to all users on the road. That is, to all vehicles. In this way, they were able to pass the maintenance costs of the roads to the real road users, they managed to avoid traffic jams and they avoided a major cause of pollution. The result of this approach was that today Singapore, despite having a very high population density and being one of the economic engines of the world, has very fluid traffic and, moreover, imposes maintenance costs based on the use of the road by each driver. That is, if the benefit you get is not greater than your toll, which is the cost of maintaining the road itself, then you leave the car at home. And if your advantage is greater, then you have avenues that you can move quickly through. Smart, isn't it? Of course, to make this possible, Singapore has developed a fantastic, very efficient and affordable public transport system. Another much more controversial measure due to its paternalism is forcing all workers to invest a quarter of their salary in a strict national savings plan that is also run by a state organization. With this program, the island government obtains workers to accumulate savings with which they can pay for health services, education services and pensions. And as this happens, the state gets the capital it needs to invest in projects, inside and outside the country, which are considered essential to the city's competitiveness. In a way, workers become not only users, but also investors in this society city. Of course, these types of interventions, in which the state maintains clear leadership. Folks, in Singapore, taxes are low. For example, someone with an income of $60,000 pays 5% income tax. Duties are practically non-existent. There is no minimum wage. Public spending accounts for around 18% of GDP and, if all this were not enough, Singapore's economy is considered the second freest in the world. You see, in the world we live in today, being peripheral or being central does not depend on the physical location of your country, it depends on whether or not you have a space and a knowledge economy. It depends on the technology. It is the only thing that can explain why countries like Singapore have a much better education than us. Albert Rivera, Spanish deputy. The result of all this is that a country that was very poor a few decades ago is now one of the richest countries in the world. And don't think it's just a question of economic numbers. Singapore also has some of the best universities, with students at the forefront of subjects such as science and math. Their healthcare system is considered excellent, there is no unemployment, there is no crime and their expectations for the future are extraordinary. For example, in the Human Development Index produced by the United Nations, Singapore ranks 10th, above countries such as Sweden, Iceland, France, and Finland. The downside, and there is one, is concentrated in its political system, which, although it is evolving, is still very restrictive of civil liberties. In Singapore, prison sentences are very high, censorship is a normal part of life, and different behaviors are usually not well received.